The night was dark, but the lights of Harlem were alive, flickering in the streets as jazz music spilled from the open doors of clubs, wrapping the neighborhood in a constant hum of energy. But amidst the music and the lively chatter, something else was brewing in the shadows, something more dangerous than the polished rhythm of the jazz, more potent than the smoke of the cigars. Bumpy Johnson stood at the corner of 125th Street, his eyes sharp, watching as the city he ruled with an iron fist pulsed around him. This wasn't just his territory, it was his kingdom. It wasn't the music that made Harlem hum. It wasn't the artists, the poets, or the intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance. No, it was Bumpy Johnson's underground empire that kept the streets alive. The story of Harlem's rise wasn't just about culture, it was about power, and Bumpy was its beating heart. He'd made his name in the streets long before the Renaissance took hold, and while the poets and musicians sang songs of freedom, Bumpy made sure no one got too free without paying a price. Tonight, the streets were a battlefield, a moment that would change everything. The rivalry wasn't just between gangsters. This was a war for the soul of Harlem, where every player, from the criminal underworld to the cultural leaders, had a stake in how the streets would be shaped. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just about survival, he was about domination. But even as he looked at the streets of Harlem, a city transformed by art and jazz, he knew his role in its history wasn't just as a kingpin. He was a force that had forged Harlem into something bigger than any one person, bigger than any revolution. Harlem was his stage, and he was the show. But as the music swirled around him, one thing became clear. Bumpy was about to discover that even a king could be outplayed in the most dangerous game of all. The game for control over Harlem's future. Harlem was more than a neighborhood. It was a revolution, a cultural awakening that had transformed the lives of black people in America. By 1941, Harlem was the center of black artistic, intellectual, and cultural life, a place where figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington had created something uniquely powerful. But beneath the surface of the Renaissance, Harlem was also a battleground, a place where power was bought with blood and the streets were controlled by men like Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's rise wasn't accidental. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy had come to Harlem with nothing but the streets as his school. By the time the Harlem Renaissance began to reach its peak, Bumpy Johnson had already solidified his grip on Harlem's underworld. The 1920s had been his formative years, learning the ropes of the numbers game, bootlegging and managing the street-level operations that kept Harlem thriving. But Harlem's transformation wasn't just an artistic revolution. It was a time when power structures were being redefined. As the Harlem Renaissance flourished, so did Bumpy's influence. But what most didn't see was the quiet alliance he had cultivated with the cultural and intellectual leaders of the time. In the back rooms of Harlem's speakeasies and jazz clubs, Bumpy had forged ties with musicians, poets, and writers who weren't just looking to escape the limitations of racial inequality. They were also looking for protection. And Bumpy was more than capable of providing it. His role in the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just about muscle or control. It was about creating a space for those artists and thinkers to thrive under his watchful eye. His understanding of power went beyond the obvious. It was about building a system, one that could coexist with the artistic revolution in Harlem while still asserting control. In the same way that Duke Ellington had composed music that resonated with the soul, Bumpy had orchestrated a criminal empire that resonated with the streets. And in Harlem, the streets were everything. Bumpy wasn't just the man who controlled the numbers racket or dealt with politicians. He was the man who had a hand in the fabric of Harlem itself. His influence stretched into the cultural heart of the Renaissance, and no one was immune to his reach. Not even the artists and intellectuals who shaped Harlem's soul. As the Renaissance gained momentum, so did the power struggles within Harlem. Bumpy was no stranger to rivalries. Gangsters and politicians had always been part of the landscape. But by 1941, the dynamics were shifting. New players were entering the scene. and some were more dangerous than the average thug or crooked cop. Harlem was a city of ambition, and ambition had a cost. The growing cultural importance of Harlem began to attract not only artists and musicians, but also outside interests, rivals from other parts of the city and even from beyond. These newcomers weren't interested in paying the price for the privilege of operating in Harlem. They wanted to take it. It wasn't just about money anymore. The heart of Harlem was at stake, and every powerful figure, from the musicians on stage to the gangsters in the shadows, knew that control of Harlem meant control over Black America's cultural future. But as Bumpy's empire grew, so did the pressure from outside forces. The NYPD had begun tightening its grip on the neighborhood, looking for ways to suppress the Black influence that had made Harlem so powerful. The politicians, too, were getting involved, trying to stake their own claim on Harlem's future. They weren't just going to let Bumpy control everything, especially not with the artists and intellectuals so closely tied to him. The stage was set for a showdown, and Bumpy was caught in the middle of it all. He wasn't just fighting for money. He was fighting for Harlem itself, for the soul of the Renaissance. But in his way stood rivals with ambitions that stretched beyond the streets and into the heart of Harlem's cultural movement. Bumpy's influence wasn't going unnoticed, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the balance of power was shifting. But as the pressure mounted, Bumpy's next move would define everything. How he navigated this battle would determine not only his future, but also the future of Harlem itself. The night the storm broke, it wasn't the sound of jazz or the whispers of revolution that filled the air. It was the screech of tires and the heavy boots of men who had come to take what wasn't theirs. Bumpy Johnson stood on the balcony of his brownstone, watching the chaos unfold. Harlem's streets had always been his domain, and he knew them better than anyone. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, he was no longer just the king of the streets. He was a symbol, a target. The men who had come for him weren't just criminals or cops. They were power brokers, businessmen, politicians, and even fellow gangsters. And they had all come for the same thing: control. The rival gangs, seeing the power of Harlem's Renaissance as a valuable prize, had begun pushing back against Bumpy's authority. They believed that with Harlem's newfound importance in the eyes of the world, they could take over and carve out their own piece of the city. But they hadn't reckoned with Bumpy's grip on the streets, nor his ability to sense weakness and exploit it. And they hadn't reckoned with his loyalty to the artists, the intellectuals, and the community that had helped build his empire. Bumpy wasn't the type to sit in the shadows and wait for his rivals to strike first. No, he'd learned long ago that in this world, it was better to be the one who struck first. The confrontation had been brewing for weeks, with rumors swirling about the outside players looking to muscle in on his territory. He'd heard the whispers, seen the players maneuvering in the shadows, but he hadn't moved until the moment was right. That moment came in the form of a raid, an organized push by rival gangs, fueled by outside money and power, meant to break Bumpy's hold on Harlem's underworld. As the men stormed the streets with their guns raised, their eyes burning with the desire for control, they thought they had the upper hand. They didn't know Bumpy like Harlem did. They didn't know that when Bumpy was backed into a corner, he was a force to be reckoned with. The clash was immediate. It wasn't a clean fight. Harlem's streets never were. Bullets flew, men screamed, and the air filled with the sound of violence. Bumpy had his men, loyal, battle-hardened men who knew the streets as well as he did. They fought with everything they had, not just for money, but for pride, for the soul of Harlem. It wasn't just about territory. It was about keeping the essence of the Renaissance alive, making sure that Harlem's creative energy wouldn't be swallowed up by the darkness that had always sought to destroy it. Bumpy led the charge, moving with calculated precision through the chaos. His mind was clear, his instincts sharp. He knew the enemy's weaknesses, their tactics, and their desperation. The gangs were desperate to carve out a space for themselves, but Bumpy wasn't going to let them do it on his watch. The confrontation was brutal, but in the end, Bumpy's men held their ground. The rivals were pushed back, their attempts to take Harlem thwarted for the time being. But it wasn't just the gunfire that made the night unforgettable. It was the message Bumpy sent. He had proved, once again, that he wasn't a man to be underestimated. Harlem belonged to him, and anyone who wanted to challenge that would have to face the consequences. In the aftermath, as the smoke cleared and the bodies were removed from the streets, Harlem returned to its rhythm. The artists returned to their clubs, the poets returned to their pens, and the jazz played on. But things had changed. Bumpy Johnson had made sure that no one would forget the price of crossing him. His name was cemented further into the legend of Harlem, not just as a gangster, but as the protector of Harlem's future. The consequences of that night's violence were immediate and far-reaching. Rival gangs were temporarily crushed, but that wasn't the only fallout from the battle. The NYPD, embarrassed by their inability to stop the clash, began to turn up the heat on Bumpy and his associates. Police raids increased, and the pressure on Bumpy's businesses grew stronger. The political establishment, too, began to take notice. Harlem's prominence in the cultural and political landscape was now undeniable, and the city's elites wanted a piece of it, either to control it or to crush it. But Bumpy, ever the strategist, didn't let the pressure break him. He knew the game, he had played it for too long. He adapted, shifting his operations, making alliances with even more influential figures in Harlem's cultural scene. He was now not just a gangster, but a protector of the streets and the artists who had come to rely on him. In the eyes of many, he had earned the title of the King of Harlem, not just because of his criminal empire, but because he had secured a space where creativity, art, and culture could thrive. Despite the law's best efforts, the community saw Bumpy as their champion. They respected him not just for his power, but for his unwavering commitment to Harlem's people. Even the artists, writers, and musicians who had once looked at him with suspicion now saw him as a necessary force, a man who could shield them from the dangers of the streets while allowing them to work in peace. In the aftermath of the battle, Bumpy's hold on Harlem was solidified, but the consequences were not without cost. While his rivals had been pushed back for the moment, Bumpy knew the struggle was far from over. The streets would always be filled with challengers, but for now, the message had been sent. Harlem was his, and anyone who tried to take it would have to face him. In the years that followed, Harlem would evolve into something even greater, something deeper than anyone could have predicted. The Harlem Renaissance would continue to flourish, but the shadows of street politics would always remain, lurking in the background. Harlem's culture, intellectual movement, and artistic rebirth depended on freedom, but freedom always came with a price, and Bumpy Johnson was the man who made sure that price was paid. It wasn't just his presence that mattered. It was the choices he made, the power he wielded, and the influence he had over the lives of those who called Harlem home. The very streets that echoed with the sounds of jazz and poetry had been shaped by his hands. Writers, musicians, and artists knew that to thrive in Harlem they needed protection, but that protection didn't come without strings. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster, he was Harlem's guardian, and his reputation spread far and wide, not only among the criminals who lived by the gun, but also among the intellectuals who lived by their pens. By 1941, Bumpy's name had become synonymous with power. He didn't just control the streets, he controlled the flow of culture itself. His business dealings, while rooted in the illegal, were intertwined with the very fabric of Harlem's future. He had forged relationships with some of the most prominent figures in the arts, offering them shelter and support, while keeping the chaos of the street from encroaching on their work. In return, they gave Harlem a new identity, a voice and a spirit that could never be silenced. But what many failed to see was the price Bumpy had to pay for that influence. While he protected the artists and the community from the forces outside, there were always those within Harlem who didn't respect his authority, and the rise of new, younger voices only served to challenge his dominance. Yet, despite the shifting dynamics, Bumpy's status was cemented. Harlem couldn't function without him, not just because of his business acumen or street smarts, but because he was a symbol of power that could not be denied. He wasn't just a part of the Harlem Renaissance. He was one of the pillars upon which it stood. But with that power came a burden. The police, the politicians, and rival factions knew that Bumpy couldn't be ignored, and they began to apply pressure in new ways. They tried to infiltrate his network, to break his alliances, to challenge his control. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't easily broken. He had lived through every storm the streets could throw at him. He had survived betrayal, gang wars, and political corruption, and he had always come out on top. In the eyes of Harlem, Bumpy was a king. But a king's reign was never permanent. The winds of change were always blowing, and while Bumpy's grip on Harlem seemed unshakable, the future was never certain. The tensions that had been building for years, tensions between the older guard and the new voices emerging from the streets, began to reach their breaking point. Harlem's identity was evolving, but Bumpy Johnson, despite his immense influence, would soon face challenges that not even he could control. By 1941, the Harlem Renaissance had become a cornerstone of black cultural identity, a force that would inspire generations. But Bumpy Johnson's role in that story was not just about crime. It was about control, survival, and most importantly, respect. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a battleground for culture, power, and identity. And Bumpy had been at the heart of it all. His legacy wasn't built on the things that most people saw, his criminal enterprises, his dealings in the dark alleys of the city, but on something much deeper. Bumpy understood the importance of protection. He understood that Harlem's future depended not only on its artists, but on those willing to fight to keep that future alive. For Bumpy, it was never about the money. It was about the respect, the control, and the fight for Harlem's soul. But like all legends, Bumpy's time would come to an end. The Harlem Renaissance would continue to thrive, but its protector would be lost to time. The streets of Harlem would never forget the man who kept the chaos at bay, the man who made sure the music could play and the writers could write. They would never forget Bumpy Johnson, the man who fought for Harlem, not just with his fists, but with his heart, soul, and every ounce of his being. And so, in the end, Bumpy Johnson's story was not just about one man. It was about the community he shaped, the legacy he built, and the respect he earned. Harlem's Renaissance was his as much as it was anyone else's. His was the untold story, the one that never made the headlines, the one that lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be told. And now, as the world looked back at Harlem's greatness, they would know. Bumpy Johnson was its heart, its pulse, and its soul. In the end, his story was a testament to the power of respect. A man could be stripped of his wealth, his territory, his allies, but if he commanded respect, he would remain a legend forever. Bumpy Johnson's legacy is one built not just on the streets of Harlem, but in the hearts and minds of those who knew him, feared him, and respected him. In a world where power was measured by violence, money, and control, Bumpy transcended the simple mechanics of crime. He became a symbol, one that represented the complex struggle for identity, dignity, and survival in the heart of New York City's black community. The Harlem Renaissance was more than just a cultural movement. It was a declaration of identity, but it needed protection. In a time when the world tried to push Harlem into the margins, Bumpy made sure it thrived. He made sure the music played, the words were written, and the artists who shaped the future had a platform. He was the guardian of Harlem's soul, a king in a kingdom where the rule of law often bent to the will of the streets. But Bumpy's story wasn't without its cost. It wasn't just about power. It was about the price of protecting something so vital. His battles were fought in the shadows, away from the spotlight, and yet he ensured that Harlem's spirit remained unbroken. He understood something that many didn't. To secure a future, sometimes you have to fight for it in ways no one expects. In the end, Harlem would change, as all things do. But Bumpy's role in that transformation would never be erased. He wasn't just a gangster. He was an integral part of the story, one of the men who helped carve out a space where creativity could flourish despite the obstacles. His fight for Harlem was a fight for dignity, a fight against a system that sought to silence, oppress, and tear down. As we look back at the legend of Bumpy Johnson, we're reminded that respect isn't given, it's earned. Through every confrontation, every challenge, and every victory, Bumpy showed that power doesn't just lie in the ability to control, it lies in the ability to protect what matters most. His legacy isn't just a tale of crime. It's a tale of the resilience of Harlem, the preservation of culture, and the respect for those who would fight to the bitter end to keep it alive. This wasn't just about one man's pride. This was about a community's dignity. And sometimes, it takes a legend to remind the world what respect really means. Bumpy Johnson was that reminder, and his story, the untold truth, will always live on as a testament to the spirit of Harlem, the spirit that refused to be broken.